Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to the LexisNexis Risk Solutions Threat to Global Security webinar series, Human Trafficking, Stolen Lives. Here are a few brief announcements. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you do have a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. If you're having any issues with the presentation or the media player, please press F5 on your PC to refresh your screen. Today's presenters are Douglas Wolfson and Mike Coates. Doug Wolfson is the Director of Financial Crime Compliance for LexisNexis Risk Solutions in Asia. Headquartered in Hong Kong, he drives strategy and product development of the risk tools used by the biggest banks in the world that help to mitigate financial crime compliance issues. Doug has been in financial services, risk management, and international business for 20 years. This includes leading risk management departments at the world's most recognizable financial institutions. Also speaking today, we have Mike Coates, volunteer with the Mekong Club. The Mekong Club is a not-for-profit organization that uses a business-to-business approach to fight modern slavery. Mike's background spans manufacturing and banking, and in early 2013, he found his passion in the financial crime arena. Mike was introduced to the Mekong Club while he was at HSBC. His vast experience handling major business deals has led him to take an active role in the club to drive better understanding of the human trafficking risks for the financial sector. Mike is also based in Hong Kong. Welcome to Mike and to you, Doug. And now take it away, Mr. Wolfson.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mary, as always, and it's great to hear your voice again. Two quick announcements before we get started. The first is just a reminder that nothing we're saying is legal advice, and if you have legal questions, please go speak to your lawyer. Don't take anything we're saying as legal advice. And secondly, a big thank you to Benoit Lewis, who without this and his technical help today, we would have struggled to get this webinar going. So thank you, Benoit. I'd like to just quickly, before we get started, go through the agenda, what we're going to be talking about. We'd really like it to be a discussion. Mike has a lot of expertise in this space, and so I think it's really valuable for you guys to hear his expertise rather than me really presenting it. And I think you have some questions. I have a lot of questions. There are a lot of things we can discuss. But what we'd really like to cover today is when we talk about human trafficking, it's really to start with the how and the why. You know, we talk about what we can do to stop it. We can talk about how terrible it is, but really understanding why people are trafficked, why people are put into slavery, and how that happens, I think helps us with the first step of understanding why we have to stop it. Then we're going to look at some case studies of, situations where it's happened, industries where it's prevalent, and what we can do then to stop it as individuals, as businesses, and then as a lot of people are on the phone in financial institutions, we wanted to focus on financial institutions as well. Finally, we're going to talk a bit about the tools and technology that you and we and the Mekong Club, the NGOs, are using to try to end human trafficking and slavery. And we'll finish off with a Q&A. But I guess, Mike, before we get into all of that, you and I have known each other for about 5 years now. We've worked together. We've played rugby together. We've become friends. And this is a passion that's really developed for you over the past couple of years. This wasn't something that you were in when we first met. What's really pushed this passion for you? How has this developed?
Okay. Thanks, Doug. Thanks for the introduction. So I think the point that was made earlier on is I sort of found this passion. There was a presentation by the Mekong Club, a gentleman called Matt Friedman, who's the CEO of the Mekong. He presented when I was at my old organization, most probably about 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know if any of you have seen the Matt presentation. I think many of you have. There's some horrific stories that run through that. And it covers multiple things which we're going to touch upon later on when we go into the case studies. It's interesting for me, a couple of things. Firstly, the response within that room was very varied. I think there was people like myself, generally with children, a bit tearful, a bit worried, a bit concerned. There was another group that was really, this is terrible, but not much we can do about it. And sadly, there was a third group that appeared to me to be more ambivalent about the thing and just moved from the map presentation into their next cup of coffee. Yeah. So it was a very strange position and clearly something that pulled on my heartstrings. At the time, I still do, had young daughters. So when they start talking about the sex trafficking, especially with the younger girls, it resonated. And there was a couple of people in the same position as me, a few guys I work with who have daughters, same sort of age. So it was a real tipping point for me, this thing about young girls getting caught in the sex trafficking. So I didn't worry about some of the other things, but that was fundamentally something that triggered it. There's probably a second trigger as well. As part of my old role, I used to go into many countries across Asia. And when I went, I would always present around this. I'd always use some of Matt's background and give some context around, is this a problem in your country, etc. I went to one particular country, which I won't name, and we talked about this. I said, I'm going to present, I'm going to talk about modern slavery, and I'm also going to touch upon the sex trafficking. Is that an issue where you are? And they said, yeah, absolutely. I said, is it young? And they said, yeah, it is young. And I said, 12 and 13, because this was obviously the conversation I'd had with Matt. Yeah. And they said, no, it's 5 and 6. Jeez. So the 5 and 6, I sort of said, are you telling me this is 5 or 6-year-old girls? They went, no. And I was thinking, thank God, I've misunderstood what they're talking about. They said it's all boys. Jeez. So it just gives you, it was a tipping point for me with my daughters and a 5 and 6-year-old, just sort of pushed me over. Yeah. One of the things I think with this, excuse me, this is a cause that I think has found me. I wasn't looking for it, but going through this very quickly made me start thinking something I should be involved in. This is all about exploitation. You know that as well as I do. Yeah. So we're going to talk about the numbers, we're going to talk about examples, but it's all about exploitation, and I felt it was something I should get involved in.
Well, definitely, and I think, what you touch upon is, for those of you who haven't seen Matt Friedman speak, if you ever get the opportunity, he's an incredible speaker. He delivers a very poignant set of stories, and really helps to understand the problem that is out there. I think what we want to do is, and what you're looking to do really as part of volunteering with the Mekong Club, is taking that next step of practically what can we do. And I think that's a large part of what we want to talk about in this webinar with you today is practically how do people end up in this situation and how can we help to stop it? Because it seems like a massive problem. Slavery has existed as long as essentially human beings have existed. And I think it's only now that we're starting to realize how problematic it really is, how horrible it really is, and that we can actually do things to stop it. Correct. So starting with that, let's start with the how. How do people end up trafficked? How do people end up in slavery?
So I think there's most probably a couple of things from what we can see. The biggest one, to be honest, is fraud and deception. Yeah. Quite often, the people that get pulled into slavery are by people they know. Yeah. This isn't just someone coming off the street, it's by people they know. So fraud and deception accounts for about 90% of all the people that get pulled into this particular space.
And how does what type of fraud is it? Are they promising untold riches? Are they promising, presumably, they're promising a way out of what is already a horrible existence?
And I think that's key, Doug, is the fact that people are in a position where they want to better themselves. And it's not just a better future for themselves, it's a better future for their families. Yeah. So there's obviously, you can imagine, aspirationally, people follow the dollar, follow the money, and clearly want to do something better for their families, etc., and themselves. That can be a better job, can be a better marriage, because people can be forced into slavery through marriage in exactly the same way. So
how does that work?
So I think with the marriages is, we'll touch upon it a little bit, especially when we talk about the sex trade, is, in some countries, Matt will tell a story about Nepal, 13 or 14-year-old girls, someone comes in from overseas, convinces the family that they should marry this girl, that they're going to give them a better future, and then they push them into a level of servitude. And that can be all sorts of things. And again, when we talk further along, I'll bring some examples up there. I think the other thing that people get caught into is the debt bondage. Yeah. Some simple examples of, you're in a country where you're earning $2 a day, someone in a family gets ill, you need to borrow $20. You've clearly got loan sharks in that particular position. Money gets lent extortionate rates, sometimes as high as 500%. Yeah. Clearly, it can never be paid back. Yeah. So what they quickly do is get someone to come in to repay that loan, and actually it very rarely gets paid off. Yeah. You can't leave until it's paid off. You're not earning enough money to pay it off. Ergo, there's a continual position as far as that slavery.
You hear stories about ending up in a factory where you have to pay for your room and board, essentially, or equivalent of room and board. You have to pay for the supplies that you're using to make whatever it is they're forcing you to make. You have to pay all of these things that they're not paying you enough to make, even if you get that money, if you're lucky enough to get that money at the end anyway.
Correct. And I think there's another thing as well. You get someone that goes away. They travel overseas. They've said to the family, I'm going overseas. I'm going to get money. I'm going to make our existence better. Yeah. There's almost an embarrassment. They get tied in, almost ashamed that they've been duped. Yeah. And almost ashamed to go home empty-handed to the point. And, you and I discussed this before. The reality is you could say these guys are stupid. I don't think they're stupid. Yeah. I think we describe it as aspirational naivety. Yeah. And that's the reality. These people are trying to get out of the environments they're in, trying to find a better life for themselves and the family, and this is their route. It's easy for us. All these people on the phone at the moment, it's easy. We haven't got this concern. Yeah. But when you're in a position where you can't put food on the table, if people are ill, you're in trouble, etc., this creates this level of desperation, which creates this aspirational naivety. Yeah.
Well, I think you find it even, we talk about people on the phone. We're all obviously in a completely different situation. I don't think there's anybody on this phone that has to worry about putting food on the table at this point, that has to worry about only making a couple dollars a day but paying off that massive debt. But people of all socioeconomic levels fall for scams, fall for get-rich-quick schemes. Everybody is looking to better themselves in a way. And so it is relatable that somebody would say, okay, you can take my daughter from Nepal to India and marry her because she'll have a better life. And I want that for my children, and maybe at some point in the future she can bring me along as well. But at a minimum, it will be better for my children. You can understand how that would happen because everybody at every socioeconomic level falls for, scams.
Correct. Absolutely correct. And as you say, the thing at the moment with us going through sort of the COVID environment, I think everyone's getting a little bit of a glimpse into what these worlds must look like. Our biggest problem is that Uber doesn't turn up on time or the Deliveroo is not there. Yeah. Actually, you're in a situation where there's a lot more desperation that sits behind this. So I think that just gives some flavour.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. As you know, my family just came back from the United States. They quarantined for 2 weeks, and so I quarantined with them. And stuck in a small space with we were only 4 people, so it wasn't even that many people, but stuck in a small space with a lot of other people for a very short period of time gets uncomfortable after a little while. And I think anybody who has been in quarantine, anybody who has been forced to stay at home when they don't want to, everybody has had that moment of frustration, of anger. Why am I stuck here? Why do I have to be here? We see it with people sort of lashing out around the globe. This is not to say that any of these things can be equated to be stuck in slavery. But I think people can start to glimpse at what being stuck in a place you don't want to be stuck at, doing things you don't want to be doing is like. Yep. And certainly would never want to equate it to slavery because, yes, my biggest problem during that time in quarantine was when the Deliveroo didn't show up on time. So it is certainly not the same thing at all. But I think it gives us a view into not being able to escape our environment, and that's where these people are, right? They are stuck in an environment where they have absolutely no ability to change their fate, essentially.
So I think we talked before about some examples. You've just touched upon the thing with the sweatshops. You can easily be in a position where someone says, come and work for us, it's going to be $50 a month, and you get there, and then at the end of the month, you get your $50 and you get a bill for $52 for your accommodation, food, etc., etc.
Exactly.
And again, that's because people sometimes people that won't be able to read, some people there regularly will not be any contracts or anything like that. So there's no transparency. It's all based on trust. So it's exploitation of people you think you can, by people who you think you can trust.
Yeah, and again, I think that aspirational naivety is that naivete. I think that they pronounce it. That people want to trust somebody else because they're so desperate to get out of their situation.
Yeah, and I think maybe just a couple more examples. Fishing boats are a great example. You get to a position where we see that we've got some examples of people in Thailand as one of the areas where this happens. They get convinced to go on a fishing boat. They're going to get good money. They're going to be looked after. It's great. They can come back to the family after a couple of weeks. Some of these guys are on fishing boats for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
They never get let off. A, they never get let off. B, if they get ill, they're working 18 hours a day and maybe longer. If they get ill, what can often happen is these people just get thrown overboard. Because the last thing you want on a fishing boat, an active fishing boat, is someone that's not well. So just get thrown away.
And if you think about, we talk about being in small confined places where people are sick. They'll just get rid of you because you don't have a value to them.
Sure.
But you think about the slight discomfort that we go through, quarantining at home, and the fact that you cannot leave a fishing boat for 4 or 5 years is horrendous.
Yeah. And I think the key there, Doug, is you said value. We will touch upon this on the next slide, but it's the value of life. Yeah, you're putting yourself in a position where the value of life is almost meaningless.
Yeah, well, that's it. And I think the question really is that the other side of the question is the why, which is, why do people traffic other people? And why do people keep them as slaves, for the horror that it causes somebody else?
Yeah, it's value. It's value. It's dollars. I think we're going to touch upon where we are across the world, but just on the fishing boats, I just want to finish off is that in what you'll often find with these people, after 4 or 5 years, they just get dropped off in any country.
Yeah.
They don't get any money. They're now in a position where they're an illegal alien in a country that they don't know.
Yeah.
And if anything, it costs their family money to get them back. So it's a sort of massively downward spiral.
Well, you talk about embarrassment about the situation that you've been duped, right? The embarrassment of that. Imagine you disappear for 4 or 5 years. Your family thinks that you're making money. You're going to come back and save them, and then you call them and say, "I need you to pay to bring me back."
Right. And I think the last one I just want to touch upon is the sex trade. Again, for those who've seen Matt's work, there will be enforced marriages. That can end up in lots of different directions, but there's definitely examples of people going into the sex trade. People with, we have stories, and we have letters from a girl that's 16 years old. She's had 7,000 men. She's been institutionally raped, basically to break her to the point where it's meaningless to her. Yeah. And then she goes through that. This particular girl passed away. She's got riddled with disease, etc., etc. So it's just the flavour of what some of these people can go through. And even though it seems, we keep saying the word slave. Every time I say the word slave, for the people on the call, if you can replace that with the word human being, it starts to put a little bit of context into what this really is.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, you've just put the why there. I think I only saw this a couple of days ago.
This sort of explains itself, right? If you have no morals, if you have no worries about how you're going to treat another human being, if it's purely an economic decision, this seems,
And this a person, so not a slave, a human being costs $100. that surely is a human thing. It's a global issue. Whether it's to do with human trafficking, whether it's to do with something else, it just gives you it gives you an insight into what the value of a person really is, and that's completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
At any price.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hugely problematic, and I think it's something that we're going to get to when we talk about companies and what companies can do. This is the sort of thing that they factor into their production line, and when particular industries say, oh, well, we can't wipe out slavery because it'll be too expensive, we're talking about the cost of human lives here. We're talking about saying, oh, it's too expensive to save people's lives, which to me seems abhorrent.
Yes, I agree.
So let's talk about some. You've mentioned some of these cases, sweatshops, fishing boats, forced prostitution. Human trafficking, I think, it often gets equated with slavery, and it often should. But also, there are people who do choose to get trafficked, people who choose to be moved over from one border to another solely for the purpose of getting across that border, and then they pay whoever trafficked them, and then it's over. But it often becomes slavery. It often becomes someone being then forced to work in a sweatshop, work on a fishing boat, as you mentioned, into forced prostitution. How when this happens, how can we get them out of it? How do you sort of get them from, a child? We have a picture here on the screen. I apologize. I'm pointing to our screen here. It's on your screen there. How does a child eventually get out of this?
So you've got two balances here, unfortunately. You've got the balance of people wanting to earn money, and they're therefore desperate. In some of these instances, they may be getting no wages, they might be getting small wages, they may be getting half of what the correct rate should be in that particular country. We've just seen that actually in the UK. There's an organisation called Boohoo was paying substantially, most probably 30% or 35% of the true rate in the UK. So that's one end of the spectrum, and it's fair to say that the whole thing with slavery is a very broad spectrum, because it is to the sweatshops, it is to the people that are earning nothing or perpetually caught up in this, and there are some people on what they would call slave wages. So there's there's a greyness between those.
Yeah.
I think trying to get people out of this again is challenging. All I would say with the sweatshops, what you want to do is you want to make sure these people are getting a real wage.
Yeah.
And we will touch upon this in a minute. But when you start dealing with the retailers, why would you deal? You're looking at the picture of the kid on the left. You would not, by any way, shape, or form, no one on this call would condone that.
Yeah.
However, he's maybe making something that you and I are wearing. Might be our shirts, might be our ties, maybe our jeans, maybe all sorts of things. So by nature, we're sponsoring it. And I think when we move on, we'll cover that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when people end up in these situations, what a lot of people have to understand is that I think we all know that the people who are controlling them take their passports away. They take away any means for them to be able to sort of escape. But if they do, you're probably in a different country, potentially in a different country, in a different place illegally, which means then if you go to the police and you're there illegally, the system isn't necessarily on your side either. And so, potentially you get deported, potentially you get to go home, but also potentially they're corrupt and you end up back where you started in an even worse position because you've tried to escape. And so, it's very difficult when you have never had an opportunity at an education, you've never had the opportunity to, a lot of these people, as you mentioned, can't read, there's no contracts. The whole system is set against you when you become part of this slavery system. And so it becomes, I think, down to us as individuals, down to the companies in the supply chain, and really the banks, and I think there are a lot of people from banks on this webinar, which is why we wanted to touch on it specifically. But the banks who are financing these businesses, it's important that they understand their roles as well and what can be done there to change it. But I think the easiest place to start is the place that we always talk about. I've seen Matt talk about it a couple of times. We talk about our behavior, right? We talk about us as individuals. And the most straightforward way when we talk about manufacturing, we talk about sweatshops, is our shopping habits and how we shop. What are your thoughts on this? Because it's interesting to hear from your perspective as somebody who's really deep in the process of trying to change people's behavior.
So there's most probably, thanks. There's most probably a couple of things. There's a thing called slaveryfootprint.org. It's a bit like the carbon footprint principle. I would ask everybody on this call to go onto it. We will send out the links afterwards, but I'd ask everyone to go onto it. You very quickly see how many slaves you actually support, and it's scary. From the top down, it's scary. The other thing, I use an app called Good On You. Good On You, I'm not advertising for them, but Good On You is very, very simple. It gives a view by organisation of whether that is your high street organisations or elsewhere. It will just say where they are in this particular space, in the human trafficking space, and more around the ESG space as well. Okay. So I use that quite often. Great example.
Sorry to interrupt you there, but is this a rating on them, or is this?
It is a rating, yeah. Okay. So there'll be a rating. So it's sort of a 1 to 5 rating. It just gives you a flavour. So I'm going to use an example again. I won't necessarily name them, but there's a retailer that my kids go to every Christmas. Easy man to buy for. Every Christmas, buy me exactly the same stuff, different colours, but exactly the same stuff. 2 years ago, was outside that particular shop, went to go in. I thought, I'm going to have a look on Good On You and see what the position is just before I go in. As I was walking in, got the Good On You view, and it was poor. So that obviously behavioural change. I then wrote to that organisation to say, look, really like your stuff. It's my kids' go-to. It's a Christmas present. Please make this a bit easier for me. I want you to improve as far as this is concerned. After a month, I got nothing. After that month, I wrote to them again, say, clearly this doesn't bother you. This isn't an issue. Immediately, they came back to tell me what they were doing, how they were going to do it, and how they were going to try and improve their process. Whether they've improved their process or not, debate number 2. Getting 2 emails from Mike Coates most probably isn't going to move the needle. We've got 100-odd people on the call, from what I understand. They get 200 emails from people, that very quickly people's behaviour starts to change. So I think the Good On You is important. And again, it's not because it's a Good On You, but if you read anything in the papers, if you read about organisations that have got child labour, human trafficking, slavery in the supply chain, yes, then you should stand your ground and say, that's not acceptable to me, ergo I won't buy this particular stuff. Yeah.
And I think maybe not for 2 old dogs like us, but the more technologically savvy, the personally technologically savvy people on social media, a couple tweets, an Instagram post brings attention to these issues very quickly in a way that even emails directly to the company can't.
Correct. So I think that impact. So I think one of the things I believe with this conversation, again, you just mentioned 2 old dogs. I'm not sure that's the right phrase, but fundamentally, this is like dropping a stone to me. It's like a ripple. So if we can start this, and we can start, especially get the younger generation to reach out more, to believe in this. Hopefully, touch wood, my children do. That's my aspiration, is to make sure that they are in that particular position. But this isn't just about, we've talked about retail, we've all got mobile phones. Yeah. Mobile phones contain things that, contain batteries that have cobalt in them. Cobalt is well known for having child slavery in the chain. What do you do? Imagine saying to everyone on the phone, you can't use your mobile phones anymore. Yeah. So it needs to be pressure to get people to start changing their behaviour. That's where my head is at this point.
All right. I think, we talk about shopping, and shopping is really, when the conversation of human trafficking, of slavery comes up, shopping is always the number 1 go-to. Sure. But I think what people don't realize is that there are other avenues where you can affect the way that companies behave, other people behave. The second of which is investing, investment portfolios.
So this sort of struck me almost by accident, to be honest. So it's all well and good to say, I'm not going to shop at a certain location. But how many of us have got investments, whether that's through pensions or other things, that are actually in exactly those companies that you wouldn't shop in? So what I try to do, and again, this is just my experience, I went back to my financial advisor and said, where is all my money placed? Is it placed in any of these areas? Interestingly, they came back and told me I had a percentage which was related to animal testing.
Yeah.
Now, that obviously isn't my immediate focus. I clearly want to make sure that's not there. So I've removed that completely and changed my investment strategy to take that out. Yeah? So it's just an example. I think animal trafficking, that's something that you're...
Well, it is. And this is not to say, we're not here to take a view on animal testing. There is, some very legitimate animal testing, absolutely. But what we found is the wildlife trafficking, which oftentimes happens hand in glove with human trafficking, that wildlife trafficking is feeding animals into testing and pharmaceutical companies. And so next week, thank you for giving me the opportunity to plug our webinar next week, which is going to be on wildlife trafficking and discussing the ills of wildlife trafficking, which are as horrible as human trafficking. But that's for next week.
So talking on the...
Thank you for the plug.
That's okay. Talking about the investments, so we've just gone through that, what we've just explained about you wouldn't invest, obviously, in somewhere that you wouldn't shop at. You've also got another thing as well. If you're banking with someone, if I put money into an institution, it will lend that money. That's the whole point. That's the value proposition for them. They're going to lend that money outside.
Yeah.
Now, would you lend your money to someone that you knew was involved in slavery?
Of course not.
Okay. Would you lend your money to an organisation that has slavery in the food chain?
Of course not.
Yeah. So I think that's another thing where you now have to say, we talked about investing, but also where do you put your money, and can that be used for something that you fundamentally would be uncomfortable with?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that point. I think it's something that people miss, and we're going to discuss in a couple slides when we talk about financial institutions and how they make loans, how they invest themselves. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that the financial institutions that are doing that business, that have that financing business, they get their money from their customers.
Right.
It's me and you and some, corporations who put their money with them. And so I think it needs to be clear. You need to understand, where you bank. You need to understand their ESG, their social responsibility platform, and the way that they do business. That is essential. I think the final bit, which is key, and it's something that I know you've undertaken at our rugby club here in Hong Kong. The Mekong Club actually sponsors us, and the logo is on our kit. And it's something that Mike speaks to us regularly about, and I see the impact of it when he speaks to both the men's, the women, and the women's teams, is awareness, right? And it's raising awareness of human trafficking, raising awareness of slavery. How can people do that better?
So I'm doing it now. I think I'm trying to bore as many people as possible with this particular subject. Again, great to have this introduction. Great to be sitting in here and being able to present to so many people. So I think just heart on your sleeve, whatever you want to call it, is just to make sure if anyone talks to you about it, give them some figures, give them some understanding, just give them a bit of awareness. I think you just mentioned about the rugby. So there's two clubs here, Sandy Bay, the rugby club, one of the Dragon Boat teams as well, Stormy Dragons. They've got the Mekong Club on the shirt. So often when you do that, especially with some of the rugby boys, they all ask where that club was. Thought it was somewhere in Lang Bai Fong, etc., etc. But it gave me the opportunity to sit with them to explain what it is and why it is. And the real benefit for me is generally these people are a younger generation. Now, the younger generation is a lot more socially aware than maybe my generation is, and maybe your generation is. Believe it or not, there's a generation between us. So there's a very different approach, and it's allowed me to do that. The rugby is a great example, I think. Robbie McRobbie, who's the CEO of Hong Kong RFU, because of the work that's been done around the Mekong Club or with Sandy Bay, he's now working on the fact to make sure that he understands the supply chain for anything that the RFU are purchasing. Yeah. Just a small thing, but lots of small things start to become bigger things. So I think that's the thing around the communication, is just to share what we're doing and share how we're doing it and why it's important. I think maybe two more. Obviously, data providers like you is fantastic to allow us to do this. And lastly, one of the schools in Hong Kong, it's now added work experience for the Mekong Club as one of the things you can do. I think it's in year 10. Yeah. So they have the ability. So a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 kids did a video. Again, I will happily share the link afterwards. But just start to make them aware, share with their friends, younger generation. It might take a little while for that to permeate through, but at least, hopefully, touch wood, they're starting to think a bit different. And that's what I'm trying to do. This is the pebble in the water thing again, trying to see that ripple out.
Well, I think it's something that you've picked up on, which is that Gen Z, later millennials, social awareness is incredibly important to these generations. And so things like this for companies, and we're about to talk to companies, is very important because your customers, whether you're a financial institution and these are people who will bank with you, or you're a manufacturer or a retailer and these are people who are going to buy from you, these generations are your current sort of 18 to 25, but your future 18 to 49 who are going to be the core spenders. And they're going to take with them the values that they are building right now around avoiding companies that use human trafficking and slavery in their supply chains, banks that finance this type of behavior. They're going to avoid those types of businesses. So it's important that companies' behaviors start to change now.
Correct. So, okay.
So if we talk about the businesses, we talk about retail, manufacturing, we've kind of lumped them together here. They are two separate pieces, but you do need somebody to sell the goods that you've manufactured if you're a manufacturer. So how can companies look for, reduce, eliminate human trafficking, slavery in their supply chain?
So I think with the retail and manufacturing, we put up here, so own your own supply chain, change the supply chain. Often we get told that actually organizations can't, it's too complex to do.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you a real simple example. Talk to a tobacco company and talk to a chocolate company. The tobacco company said it has to follow the supply chain all the way to the fields. And the reason for that, what it doesn't want is any substandard tobacco getting into its products and or getting into other products, counterfeit products. So it follows it all the way to the field.
Yeah.
The chocolate company was, we can't possibly do this because we can't possibly get to the field. Now, I'm sure the manufacturing process, I'm no expert, between tobacco and chocolate is very, very different.
Nor am I. So again, not legal.
Yeah. But intuitively, you would think there's some consistency between those two particular areas.
Yeah.
So it's just an example of, actually, you can follow the chain. Actually, it sometimes comes at a cost. This most probably sometimes comes as a cost, has to come back on us as individuals as well. If we go in, if we buy something that's too good to be true, the chances are it's too good to be true. There's something in there that we need to consider. So I think that's the thing with the supply chain, is you need to be able to follow that to a level of having that comfort. Yeah, and that could be whether your manufacturers are being audited, but you need to have that level of comfort.
Yeah.
If you're going to audit, the last thing you can do is say, we're going to come and audit you next week, because chances are the slaves won't be sitting there. So that needs to be very, it needs to be very transparent. You need to go through the right level of rigor to make sure that's okay.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Well, and I think you raised the point to me in previous discussions, which is essential, which is, if you have an ESG team, you have a corporate social responsibility team, and they state, we are going to take slavery out of our supply chain, and then your procurement team shows up and says, well, you have to give us a 10% discount on this price, the two don't work together very well.
And I think with a lot of the retailers, that needs to be joined up, because being able to take slavery out of the chain, and I'm most probably going to segue a little bit here. There was a thing last year, or 2 years ago, when I was in the US, Donald Trump was focused very much on human trafficking, very nervous about slavery. Now, you might have your own thoughts about Donald Trump, but fundamentally he didn't strike me as a man that would particularly care about this. However, the reason it became important, because he suddenly realized that what it did is it created commerciality. There was an uncompetitiveness. Because you have one organization that's paying for people and one organization that isn't, it created this gap. So, maybe I'm being disparaging, maybe he does care about it, but fundamentally it creates an economic value which clearly changes the perspective. I think to your point around the ESG and procurement, going in to say you must spend more money and do the right thing, and by the way, we want 10% off, is completely counterintuitive. And if you keep pushing that, we must have 10% off, you will end up where you, by nature, will drive that requirement to put slaves into the food chain in one way, shape, or form.
Well, I think it's really a practical takeaway for the people who might be at retailers, at manufacturers here, who might work in banks and departments that finance these companies, is that ESG and the procurement teams just have to work together, right? I would say the vast majority of companies, those two teams are probably not speaking to each other. It's difficult enough oftentimes to get the fraud and financial crime compliance teams to talk to each other, and they sit in the exact same space. To get the ESG and the procurement teams, who are in completely different spaces, to talk to each other is going to take some effort, but has to be done.
And I think the point you made earlier on as well, if people don't fix this, the newer generation is more concerned about social responsibility. If you don't fix this, you're going to lose your customers.
Yeah.
Full stop. So it will be a short-term gain, and maybe this is some of the market pressure of trying to keep all your shareholders happy for the next 12 months, rather than looking longer term. But your longer term, you will drop off a cliff in my view, without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah. And when you talk about the economic cost of slavery being, in dollar terms, significantly less than the cost of having reasonable wages for your employees, I look at, if you look at the bribery and corruption space, right? Bribes are often seen as a short-term fix to a long-term problem, which is, how to get things cheaper, how to get things into a specific country, all of these things. But companies that don't pay bribes are still successful. And so this is very similar to me in that those bribes reduce your economic cost, but they're not a long-term solution. It's the same thing here. Having slaves will reduce your cost, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be more competitive in the long term, because in reality it leads to less innovation because you have less cost. A lot of the same issues with paying those bribes. You end up in a position where you're a less competitive company than if you paid reasonable wages to your staff and you were forced to continue to innovate and create better products. Yeah. And so I think it's something that companies really need to think about if, as they're trying to root slavery out of their supply chain, they unfortunately there's a decent chance they'll find it. But there is a world post-slavery. There is an ability to get rid of it and still have a competitive company, still create competitive products.
And I think, to your point, people will find it. If you look hard enough, you'll most probably find it. It could be the buttons on your shirt. It could be the labels in the back of your shirt. It could be a million and one things. The most important thing is that organizations are working on it to improve it. So I'm not saying if you find an organization that has this, just immediately go, never going to deal with them ever again. If you know that they're working to improve it, I think you're in a better place.
Well, the clothes retailer that you mentioned before, I would imagine if you got a better response from them, you would have been willing to continue to buy their clothes.
Right.
It was more the lack of response and lack of willingness to do anything that was what led you to stop.
Correct.
Buying their clothes. And I think that's the key thing is, we all behave rationally, right? And so people understand that other people aren't perfect, companies aren't perfect. But if you continue to try and solve the problem in front of you, then people will be more understanding than if you just simply ignore them, as in your case. And so finally we come to the financial institutions. And a lot of people on this call are in banks. A lot of people will be in financial crime compliance, anti-money laundering departments. What can financial institutions do to help reduce and end human trafficking and slavery?
So clearly this is my favorite bit. So I think from financial institutions, it's really, from a human trafficking perspective, we just mentioned about $100. Yeah. It's impossible to spot, almost impossible to spot. You'll talk about some of the tools later on, which I'm sure will help, but it's very, very difficult to pick up. This to me is always like the iceberg. If you think about, if I'm a drug dealer and I'm doing 1,000 lots of 1,000, then I've got $1 million that I need to try and hide in one way, shape or form. Yeah. If you've got, this is below the water, this is the piece of the iceberg that's below the water, because there's no real financial transaction. You bought someone from $100, they're doing $500 worth of work, you sort of don't notice that. It's just the goods are a bit cheaper. Yeah, so it's very, very difficult to spot. What you do need, I think, from a institutional perspective, financial institute, you need experts that can spot this stuff. You need experts who will be able to dig out areas where they think there's challenges. It's very, very difficult. This isn't standard FCC. So we've all done FCC training. It's not the same thing, because the FCC is above the waterline. This is very much, in my opinion, below the waterline. So you need experts that really understand it. You also need institutional awareness. So lots of people out here have got slavery statements for their organisation. And anyone that's from a financial institution, if you go onto your slavery statement, you'll most probably notice that it tells that everyone's been trained. Everyone's done this. Everyone's done this through human trafficking. I did a presentation recently to an organisation, 80 members of staff. I said, has anybody in here been trained on human trafficking? They said no. Many of them have been there for many years. The modern day slavery statement said, categorically, everyone has been trained on human trafficking. So what I would suggest is this shouldn't be tied in with FCC, with financial crime. It needs to be a completely separate thing, even if it's a 15-minute video or 15-minute sort of training course, is to explain to people about human trafficking and why it's there.
And I think the importance of that, the reason for that is very simply that when human trafficking is one small piece of the broader FCC training, a company can believe that it's given training when in reality, a couple questions on an exam to say that you've done the training is really not training.
Correct. That's exactly where my head is. I mean, clearly from a financial institution, don't support bad actors, but the point I made earlier on, if someone's working on it, then that's someone that you should stick with. Also, if you exit an organisation because they're a bad actor, don't sell a fund that contains that bad actor, because you're really making no difference. Yeah. Or at least if you do sell that fund, sell it with a health warning. If I'm buying that from you, from an institution, I'd want that health warning to be able to explain. And that's what I now get from my financial advisor around the money that I invest. And I think maybe the last thing around this is ESG. Lots of people now are doing ESG funds. Make sure the ESG fund isn't just environmentally focused, because a lot of people focus on the environmental, the green part of this. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but often people buy these things thinking they are ESG, when in fact they're sort of focused in one particular part of that statement.
Yeah, and look, I'm sure there's plenty of overlap. If a company is willing to have slavery in its supply chain, there's a decent chance it's overlooking environmental issues as well. But I agree. I think there needs to be that focus. And again, we're going to discuss next week the wildlife side. There needs to be that focus on, what is the company doing to root these things out before you're willing to tell people to invest in it.
Yeah. And maybe exactly the same conversation to round off from the retailers is, if institutions don't change what they do, they're going to lose customers. They're not going to lose me and Doug. We're most probably too sticky within their environment to move along. But what you'll do is you won't get the new customers. You won't get the new generation, the Generation Z.
Yeah. To sort of I guess, finish the conversation on what we can do, this really highlights to me how everything goes back to those products and the people, the slaves, the human beings, as you say, are manufacturing those products. If you look at the individuals affect the financial institutions, they affect the retailers, they affect the manufacturing. The financial institutions touch on all of them. Everything comes back to each other. Everybody leans on everybody else in this system. And if you take one piece out, if the individuals stop buying products that, potentially have slavery or have slavery in the retail, in the manufacturing chain, if they stop investing in companies or putting their money with banks that support and finance slavery, you can realistically put a dent in slavery.
So if it's just you and I, Doug, the answer's no.
Yeah.
If it starts to ripple, which is the debate we keep having, then I think the answer will be yes. So that's where, this picture is fundamental to your point. If that product is red in any way, shape or form, it basically colours the whole picture. Yeah? You cannot be, you might be ignorant of it, but if you know about it, once you've seen it, you've seen it. It can't be unseen if you see something within that. Clearly, if the manufacturing processes are being improved or the retail processes are being improved, then that would give you more comfort to go back to those organisations, which I think is key. I'll leave this one that I mentioned. If it gets better, I will absolutely go back.
Yeah. And I think, look, for the people out there who say, there's nothing we can do about this, we can't end this. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, there was child labor in the U.S. workforce. 200 years ago, there was child labor in the U.K. workforce. These were kids, oftentimes were slaves, and that's gone.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen anymore to the extent that it was happening previously. So some of these problems can be solved. We just have to choose as a society to want to solve them.
Yeah.
So if we move on a bit now, and this will be a little bit more presenting, apologies, because it's the side that I am more focused on. There are tools and technology that are out there that are starting to look for these things. The ability to use artificial intelligence, machine learning, to look for suspicious behavior, to look for suspicious transactions, is starting to develop to the point that it can find these behaviors, even in significantly smaller sizes. Because, and we talk about this a lot here, we talk about it with our clients a lot, what we look at is behavior. We don't look at exact amounts. We're not threshold monitoring. We're transaction monitoring. What is behavior that seems weird? And I think a lot of companies, the Mekong Club as an NGO, develop typologies. And I think typologies broadly are a really good way to start as a jumping off point. But it doesn't tell you what the sizes of the transactions are, what the timing of the transactions are. When can you spot transactions? And there's one that my manager, who's based in the U.S., who was in law enforcement for 10, 15 years, that he often discussed is in the U.S., and it's a little bit different out here in Asia, but in the U.S., if you have a massage parlor that's making transactions at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, there's a decent likelihood that that's not massages. And once it's not massages, there's the potential that there is some level of trafficking and slavery in there as well. And so, it's looking for behavior that isn't normal, that isn't standard, that's outside the norm. And I think the great thing with banks is that you get a lot of these transactions, especially the larger banks that have credit cards, because you see not only the banking transactions, but you see the credit card transactions as well. And so looking for those transactions, trying to find those transactions, filing STRs, SARs, and making sure that you are, highlighting these risks is essential. And then when you find those risks, add those individuals to your blacklists. We work with, we here at LexisNexis Risk Solutions do work with NGOs who, when they find individuals, raise them to us. And in our World Compliance Database, which is a risky individual, risky entity database. If we do the research and find public sources that confirm this, we'll add them to our database. And so, I think there are a lot of things that can practically be done to try to solve this from a financial and transaction level. So we are getting close to time, and there are a couple questions here. Remember, please hit the Q&A button if you do have a question, but just some final key takeaways.
So I think just on this, I think we've touched on the fact that don't put your money somewhere, whether that's investment or buying things, which has got your sponsoring slavery. There were 40.3 million slaves throughout the world. Yeah, numbers most probably a bit bigger now. The reality is, during the slavery period that everyone talks about and everyone thinks about, I think there was something like 11 million people over a 370-year period that got caught in that. So this is a completely different scale. While we've been on this call, just over 1,000 people have been moved into slavery. Yeah. Just to give you some context of what we're talking about at the level of movement that's going through. So I think the point, avoid buying the things that you feel has slavery in the chain. But I think that's most probably the summary. I'm conscious that we've got more questions, but as I say, it's 1,000 people just while we've been on the call.
Yeah. Look, I think that it's key, and you can see on here the takeaways. It's all the things that we've been discussing, right? These 40.3 million slaves, as you say, it's not 40.3 million slaves, it's 40.3 million human beings, right? And I think that that's the important thing. When we use the word slave, it's sort of a euphemism, getting away from using the word human beings, which is essential.
And that's more human beings than there are Canadians. To give you some context.
Yeah, it's a massive number. Absolutely. So, don't let your money be used to support and sponsor human trafficking and slavery. Don't let your company's money be used to support and sponsor human trafficking and slavery. And if you are in the manufacturing business, look in the supply chain and see, what exactly is in there and whether or not it is something that's in your supply chain. I think that's key. I think at that point, Mary, we might have time for one or two quick questions.
Yeah, I think so. And I wanted to start with you, Mike. You gave 2 resources to find out, to monitor our own behavior. So I already went on the first one, the Good on You app. I found that. But what was the first one you said?
The other one was called slaveryfootprint.org, but I'm happy to share it after this meeting.
Yeah, we'll send out a follow-up email with all of this information as well to everybody.
Wow, fantastic. Okay, and then go ahead, Doug.
Maybe we have time for one question, Mary. Okay, apologies. If you have asked a question and we're not going to be able to get a chance to get to it, we will reply to you over email directly.
So for financial institutions, Mike, is there a structured framework that you can suggest to identify trafficking activities and protect companies from possible violations and criminal practices?
To be honest, it's challenging. At the point I made earlier on, is trying to get this. It's very difficult through transactions to spot some of this. You made the point, Doug, that you need to be a bit more forensic about this to spot some of these issues. The biggest way we find is actually when someone is identified. Yeah. At that point in time that you can share it. I think it is this thing we talk about in the supply chain. I think the key things around auditing some of the manufacturers, et cetera, to pull some out. But to be fair, Mary, it's a great question, but it's very, very difficult to respond to. It's not simple.
I think when you look at the factories, the fishing boats, the people who are enslaving others, they know that their behavior is criminal. And so they're going to do everything that they can to hide it from everyone in their supply chain, from the financial institutions who are eventually financing it. And so, it's going to take a significant amount of forensic work to find it, I think.
And some of these are called out. They are out there in the public domain, some of the companies that have this in their supply chain. I think the secret is, again, as we mentioned earlier on, write to them to say, you know what, guys, I'm not going to use you anymore. This is the reason I'm not going to use you.
Yep.
I wanted to mention that we've got a survey there for our audience, and while you give your closing comments, maybe we could put that short survey up so that our audience can also fill that out for us. I want to say thank you very much to everyone for doing that. What do you want to leave us with today, Doug?
Thank you, Mary. Look, I think at the end of the day, thank you to everybody who joins. Just by joining this call, it shows that this is a subject that you care about, and that you can help make a difference, right? It's not just Mike and the Mekong Club, Matt, Phoebe, who's also on the call. It's not just them pushing as an NGO. It's not all of these NGOs that are pushing. It requires all of us. And so, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you for being a part of the discussion. I've put up my contact info and Mike's contact info. If this is something you want to discuss, if this is something that you want more information from, that our follow-up emails doesn't give you enough information on, please reach out to either one of us. And we'd be happy to share more information with you about how you can help.
So I'm just going to leave you with one thing. I think tonight when you tuck your kids to bed, think it could be those children. Yeah. Just think of it like that. As human beings, just think of it like that. That's the thing that gives me the inspiration, aspiration, I'm not sure what the word is, but to continue with the Mekong Club.
So thank you very much, Mike, for joining me, and thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Doug, and want to remind everyone to join us again next Thursday, August 27th at 10 a.m. for the second Threat to Global Security webinar series, Crimes of Wildlife Trafficking. And just like Doug said, if we didn't answer your question, representatives from LexisNexis Risk Solutions will be in touch shortly with the information you need, and we'll also send the webinar recording within the next few days. Once again, thank you very much for attending, and have a good day.